Alright, guys. Masculinity is fire. It's gonna be a very interesting video because I had a conversation with my friend on this topic about like whether toxic masculinity exists or not and what exactly is it. How would you actually define it, right? And I made a video a couple months ago, like around 2 to 3 months ago, saying that toxic masculinity does not exist. And this is gonna be sort of a critique on that video. Not necessarily just that, but I'm gonna get deeper in detail of it because I think this distinction has to be made because a lot of the times nowadays we hear the sayings like toxic masculinity is a real problem that the male are dealing with, in the red pill community. This whole concept is condemned. And we sort of bash the feminist and left wing community for saying these things exist. And to be honest, I definitely agree with that, bro. If you believe toxic masculinity is real, watch this video because like you'll be I'm gonna give you guys an analogy and like I'll illustrate it throughout this video. So the analogy is that like fire, masculinity, it can be toxic. Okay, so I'll start off by saying that masculinity can be toxic, depending on what you are. Now usually when you go onto the social medias, like they'll lie to you, they'll tell you like I went and I searched this up, so I'm looking at my notes right now. They'll tell you that homophobia, that's toxic masculinity. A need for control, that's toxic masculinity. Promiscuity, that's toxic masculinity. Refusing to help with household duties, that's toxic masculinity. Risk taking, toxic masculinity. That's stupid. That's risk taking is toxic. Okay. Sexual aggression towards women, toxic masculinity. Stoicism, toxic masculinity. Violence, toxic masculinity. Like you could actually search this. I swear to God, this is literally. I went up and I searched toxic masculinity examples, and this is what came up. Okay, it's literally if you just go search it up, please. So I'll give you guys the real examples, right? And before we go into that, we have to make the distinction that we gotta critique the term toxic masculinity because what it does is that it attaches the idea that there is a toxic element or there can be a toxic element to masculinity. It attaches it kind of creates that association with masculine elements with toxicity, which in a way is true, but what it implies is very dangerous. Okay, so the best way for me to say is that masculinity can be toxic, and it's not necessarily the masculinity itself, it's the way that it's being used. So examples of this would be people like gangsters, rapists, prison inmates. And these things come from, problems such as no father figure, broken households, trauma, people who probably have bad mental health problems, right? Who have addictions and really addicted to like the modern ways of life. And so the biggest problem that like people in the red pill community and the manosphere community have pointed out is that seems to be a huge absence of father figures, right? In these broken households in the West. And when you actually look at it, the statistics actually correlate very strongly with people who have no father figures and the likeliness that they'll become a rapist or a gangster or like do any of these types of things. We see this type of stuff all the time. So it's not necessarily the masculinity. It's not really like the notion that people try to get that like risk taking and stoicism and all this stuff is like the actual toxic part. It's not necessarily that. Because a gangster, right? Like violence, we can try to say like it's sort of a masculine element. Gangsters, they can be violent. The thing is though, there's two sides of masculinity. And this is why I say masculinity is like fire. Because like fire, it can be used in a constructive way, but it can also be used in a destructive way. So what is examples of this? An example of this is how fire can be used. It can be used to cook food and like take care of all these basic needs, but fire can also be very dangerous. It can burn the house. Like in this house, like if I'm sleeping on my bed and it's burnt, like bro, toxic masculinity, the fire is gonna, be to my detriment. But also, you gotta remember that you can also use it, and it will improve your quality of living. It will make life more comfortable, and that's exactly how masculinity works. When you look at the constructive elements of masculinity, what we have masculine men who built the houses that I've literally that I'm living in right now, who built this phone, put together this mic, who gained the resources to go and do that. Okay, people, masculine men are people who are hardworking. They protect. They are probably in a good mental stage. Examples like police, not the police who like are crazy. You know what I'm saying, like George Floyd, but like I'm talking about like police that actually protect the community, firefighters, soldiers, exactly those things. Now, some other source problems of destructive masculinity might also be a lack of prosperity. This is another type of thing too, because the competition is a very big factor in the masculine element. But yeah, these are some examples of some constructive and destructive um masculine elements. And if you guys still don't really understand what I'm trying to go, it's like, let me give you a further example to further illustrate the point, right? Nowadays, it's a big problem that we have, unfortunately, women who falsely accuse men for rape allegations, right? And in the way that they do this, they sort of weaponize their femininity against these men. They weaponize the fact that they are vulnerable people to sort of be able to make these accusations against men, and like men can't really do anything about it unless you got money for that lawyer. And so, I'm not saying this to sort of take away from anybody who experienced something like that of that sort, but it's just to illustrate the point that, it's not necessarily like in this situation of the woman, we wouldn't necessarily say that her femininity or the fact that she's vulnerable is the toxic part. We would actually say it's her intention behind it and the purpose behind it and the way that she's using it. So all in all, I say all of this to say that masculinity isn't really what is toxic. Even when we're talking about masculinity in terms of gangsters and like rapists, it's not necessarily the actual masculinity or the testosterone in these men that is the actual problem. It's the way that it's being used, because it can be used in a constructive way or in a destructive way. The same way, it's like saying like we need to get rid of fire because it can burn houses. Obviously, like, we know that would be nonsense. It's not necessarily the masculinity or the fire that is the problem. It's the way that it's being used. So yeah, that's my own 2 cents, bro.